Hello, my name is Neil Davidson and I'm the founder of Raw Umber Studios. Welcome to another online portrait drawing session. This video mimics the structure of a regular life drawing class. We'll show you 3 photographs on the screen, one for 10 minutes, one for 20 minutes, and one for 30 minutes, and it's your job to draw the photograph that you see. Lizet will be joining us. She'll be doing a demonstration in the bottom corner of the screen and giving hints and tips. Once you've finished, don't forget to post your work to Instagram and hashtag it with #RawUmberLive. Right, let's get started.
Hello everyone and welcome to another Raw Umber portrait video. This week I thought it would be good to do a recap of all the basics, proportions and the box method for those of you who are new to this channel, and of course for those of you who would like a recap. So I'm going to start by placing my portrait straight on the page where I want him to be. The next thing I look for is the center line, so the line going from the chin all the way to the middle of the forehead. Next, I'm finding some very useful measurements, and those are the midpoint of the face and the 3/3. These 3/3 are usually on an ideal face, the chin to the bottom of the nose, the bottom of the nose to the brow line, and a brow line to the forehead. The midline is usually where the eyes, the corners of the eyes, are located. Next, I'm going to have to find the widest point of his face, and in his case that is around the brow line, so he's got a bit of a heart-shaped face. When I measure, I see that being exactly the same width as 1/3 of his length of his face. So once I've got that, I can just put in a gently sloping sort of angle, indicating his rough head shape. Now, breaking this down a little bit further, if you look at the lower 1/3, you can break that up into thirds again. And the first third, the lowest third, will be his chin, so the bulge of the chin. And the upper third will be where the top lip starts. When drawing a lip, the top lip always has the same sort of shape. It's a sort of an S shape. It dips in the middle, raises on the corners, and then dips again in the very corner of the mouth. The lower lip can usually just be indicated by a little bit of shadow that just usually is right underneath there. When looking at the jawline, it usually starts where the corner of the mouth also starts, so you can do a horizontal line and then bring the jaw in. It's also useful to see how wide the block of the chin is by comparing it to how wide the corners of the mouth are, or the corners of the eyes, for instance. Now let's move on to the eye sockets. There should be about 4 or 5 eyes. This depends on the person. In his case, I can measure about 4 eyes across. So that means half an eye on the sides of his skull, 1 eye, and then 1 eye in the middle in between his eyes. So I can just indicate that by placing that. And then using that, I can see where his nose is located. And again, his nose is about 1 eye wide, so I can indicate that straight down. So like I said, the eye sockets are usually that final third high, but because he is a little bit off the ideal measurement, which is not really ideal, but it's just a nice sort of placeholder, I'm going to place his brows a little bit lower than I think they should be. Now, indicating the ears, you can see on him, they are located between the corners of his eyes and the bottom of his nose. The ears are always located somewhere between the bottom of the nose and the top of the brow. It depends a little bit on what person. Some ears are lower, some ears are higher, and this goes for all these sort of measurements. And seeing how a person deviates from those measurements also is very useful in determining their likeness. Some people are wider at the top of their heads, and some people have more narrow chin or a wider nose, and that helps a lot with getting the likeness. When drawing the eyes, it's always useful to first sort of sketch in the eyeball so you have an idea where that sort of sits, and then putting in the corners of the eyes. And when you draw an eye, always make sure that there's a high point, so a point that the lid is most divergent from a straight line on both ends. It's usually a bit of an almond sort of shape. Finally, you can draw in the iris. This might sound obvious, but the iris should be in the same position in the eyeball on both eyes. Now these are the main measurements of a face that looks straight at you. It's one of the easiest poses because there's not a lot of distortion going on, so we can keep to these rules. Next, what we're going to do is do a side view of the face, and the same rules will apply. And finally what we'll do is we'll do a 3/4 face, which will be a lot more tricky. So let's see how that goes in the 20 and 30 minute pose. So here we are for the 20-minute pose, and I'm going to explain to you the same big proportional measurements that relate to the side of the head. So first placing my face, or sorry, my portrait on the paper. And when you look at most skulls, the width will be roughly equal to the height. So this depends on the person. Some people have longer faces, some people have wider faces, but I'd like to start with a big box. To find the midpoint of the box, it's very easy to put a cross in there, and that gives you the exact midpoint, and that is where the ear will be located. And then when you're looking at tilt, it's very useful to look at the zygomatic arch, which is the midpoint of that box, which is the bottom of the eye socket to the top of the ear. So you can feel it on yourself as well. So it goes across. From that midpoint of the ear, you can drop the jawline down towards the front of the face. And that same midpoint also is the place where the back of the skull starts. And from there you can just round off the skull a little bit. So that's a generic skull that you can fit to most people. Now I'm dividing the face up to 3/3. So again, like we said in the 10-minute pose, bottom of the chin, bottom of the nose, top of the brow, and then hairline. And at this point I should probably also say sorry about the footage. I accidentally filmed a little bit too far to the left, so the tip of his nose is just not quite into the footage. Sorry about that. Placing the ear between the brow and the nose, always tilting a little bit backward. The ear is not actually straight. And then I can connect the big muscles of the neck. And this is just a placeholder. Now it's time to start breaking these things down a little bit further. When you look at the front of his eye socket, you can see that it sort of deviates backwards. And the way to look at the angle is to see how it deviates from a straight line. So if I draw a straight line, you can imagine it's a bit of a clock, for instance. You can see that this deviates like a little pie shape from that straight line. And you're looking for that same angle whenever you do a diagonal. So that's what I do in my head every time I put a diagonal down. You can always imagine where things point towards each other. So for instance, that plane I just put down for the lips sort of points away from the brow, so it doesn't point towards the brow. So that's another way that's useful to figure things out. I see his nose, the bridge of his nose sort of coming from that midpoint of his eye. So I can just get that angle in, again looking at how it deviates from the straight line. And like we did in the 10-minute pose, the lower half of the face can be divided into thirds again, the upper third being the bottom of the top lip, and the lower third being the mass of the chin. Okay, so now putting in that front plane of his eye socket, which I see is sort of parallel to the front plane of his brow. And when I look at that, it should fit 3 times in front of the ear. So the corner of his eye to the front of his brow should be 3 times that size. So that gives me an indication of where his eye socket will be located. I'm just going to sort of envelope that in, so I've got an idea of where it's going to be, and then move on to something else for a minute. And I try to move on to something else every minute or so, just because otherwise you get too invested in one piece of your drawing and you might start making a small error here and a small error there, which is completely natural and normal. But when you get too invested in one piece of your drawing, those small errors do pile up and then get to a point where later you realize, oh God, I should have changed that, but I've spent 2 hours on it. So I try to just look at things from a very general perspective, knowing I'm probably making errors, and then so moving on to the next thing. And every time I put more information into something else, I can see that that first thing I did was slightly wrong, and that helps me not get too invested in what I'm doing. So on that topic, now I've got everything roughly in, I want to get going on some major changes. So I'm going to start putting the shadows in. And when it's important about shadows is that you've got 2 types. You've got cast shadow. So for instance, behind his ear, that shadow is being cast by his ear. And then you've got form shadow. So for instance, his neck, it's a round tube. And at some point that tube turns away from the light. And that's about there. So that is a form shadow. And form shadows are usually softer, whereas cast shadows start really sharp and crisp and then soften up as they get further away from the object that's cast as shadow. So I'm just going to fill the shadows in wherever I see them. And you can see that when I'm doing shadows as well, I'm also making small adjustments whenever I see them. Keeping things general, not adding more detail necessarily, but just changing the stuff that I have into a more accurate place. Next, I'm gonna get going on the eye. So starting with the eye, usually the darkest area is the brow. So the front of the brow will be darkest. And then as the brow proceeds towards the end of the head, so the side of the head, it will get more sparse and a little bit lighter. From the side, the eye is a simple V shape, so one line for the lid, the top lid, and one lower line for the lower lid. And it's useful to imagine that it's a round ball that sort of lays underneath that eye socket, so it helps you sort of see how the lids would encapsulate that eyeball. And if I just draw that underneath, you can imagine that there's this really badly drawn eyeball, and the lids sort of lay on top and sort of protect that eyeball. So the lids always stick out a tiny bit more than the actual eyeball. And then you've got the iris sort of sitting on top of there. From the side, you don't actually see that much iris, so you could just have a little bit of a dark accent and that will be enough. For the lips, again, sorry about the camera angle. It's the same as what we said in the 10-minute pose. It dips in the middle, then goes up again, then dips again towards the corner of the mouth, and those then go up again, depending on how much someone is smiling. You can often make someone smile just by dipping the corners of the mouth up a little bit more, or make someone look a little bit more angry if you just lower the corners of the mouth a teeny bit. Next week, I'll be doing a video on expressions, so I'm going to get more into how these big blocks and moving them around will give different expressions. But for now, I think that's enough information. So the last thing I want to talk about is the ear. You can imagine the ear as a little bit of an oyster shell. So it's sort of that same sort of, ear shape. So wider at the top and more narrow at the bottom. So similar to an oyster shell. And then it dips into a sort of ball-like shape. So the edges of the ear are actually higher and it dips down towards that hole of the ear. So usually when I do an ear, I first get going on those edges that sort of curl around. And then I add that big dip of the whole of the ear where it sort of dips down. And then you've got a little bit of a protection, a little bit of skin in front of it right there. That sort of sits in front of that hole of the ear. And that's really most of what you need for an ear. Then finally, it's useful to realize that the front of the ear is actually not separate. So I try to lose a little bit of line there. So at the moment, we've got a very clear separation there. So I try to just sort of indicate that the lower half and the outer half is very separate by indicating that with a line, and then removing some charcoal in the front. So to show that it is attached to the rest of the portrait. Okay, so that's it for the main proportions of the face from the side. So now we've done the front, we've done the side. So let's have a look at the 3/4 head in a minute. Okay, so here we are for the 30-minute pose. And just to let you know, 3/4 heads are a lot trickier. So don't worry if you find this one significantly harder than the other two. It's just our brains, for some reason, really like symmetry. And you'll possibly find that your brain wants to move the head towards you. So it's always really hard to get the spacing right when you're doing a 3/4 head. Okay, so starting with the front of his head, I'm finding that center line. So taking some of the stuff that I spoke about in the 10-minute pose, and I'm going to take some of the stuff I spoke about in the 20-minute pose. So I've got the tilt of his head using that center line. And then dividing it up into thirds again. And like I said in the 10-minute pose, his width of his head should be 1/3 long, but because he is 3/4, we don't see quite as much on the other side. So comparing that to the other width, I see that it's about being 2/3. So actually I've got to take that in a little bit on the right side. And then when I've got that, I can put a big box in for the front of his face. I'm finding the midpoint as well. And in this case, because he's looking up, the midpoint is not actually the center the eye line. It's going to be more like the lower eye socket. And it's just because he's looking up. Now the box is actually not going to be flat this time because it's 3/4. So we have a side of the head and the front of the head. And to find the side of the head, you can find that same angle used for the side view before. So just bottom of the eye socket to top of the ear. And that will be the angle that we can make a whole box. So you take that over to the top and also to the bottom. And trying to find the midpoint of that side of the box, we can do it exactly the same way we did before, just putting a cross in and placing the ear behind it, following the top of the brow and the bottom of the nose. And like we did in 20-minute pose, we can start carving in front of that ear. And then like we did in a 10-minute pose, we can start carving in the front plane of the face to create that jawline shape, roughly in line with the top lip. Now I can start carving in for that big eye socket that we spoke about in a 10 and 20-minute pose. And also figuring out that side plane. So where exactly does it turn from the front into the side? And that's usually at the high point of the brow. You can see the shadow very clearly. And then goes wider to the widest point of his face, so his cheekbones, and then narrows again towards his chin. And using the eye measurement, I can figure out how wide the nose is and just dropping 2 straight lines following the center line down to find the sides of his nose. Now at this point it's useful to note that that whole straight line thing was a bit of a simplification. In reality, faces are a little bit more, they protrude a little bit more in certain places. So some people have a jawline that sticks out a bit more and the forehead slopes back. In his case, his nose is the widest point of his face, so his forehead slopes back and his chin slopes back slightly. And it's useful to adjust your center line slightly so it sort of helps finding things a little bit more accurately. Now for the mouth, like we did in the 10-minute pose, just dropping down those 2 lines to find the corners of the mouth. And for those of you who would like a little bit more of an in-depth tutorial, a bit of a catch-up for all of these big proportions, I did do a video called How to Draw a Head on the Raw Umber YouTube channel. Might be useful to have a look at that. I go over all the main measurements again, just showing you how I construct a head. So it might be good to have a look at that if you're still feeling like it's quite a lot of information and you'd like to have a recap. I'm also hoping to add a full-on portrait course on a subscription service, but let me know if you would be interested in that, and I can see if we can get that going after the bar course. Now just going to add shade on all the planes that turn away from the lights. And again, like we said before, the eyes should be, well, in this case, I see them roughly line up with the top of his ear because he's looking up a little bit, but they should be in line. And then putting in the big eyeballs just so you've got an idea where everything is. And like we did in the 10-minute pose, then you can start following that roundness of the eyeball with the lids. And once I've done that, I'm going to follow the nose down as well, trying to figure out the front plane of the nose, so that's a narrow strip of the nose in the middle, and then the two side planes of the nose as well. And in this case, because he's looking up, we actually see a little bit of the bottom plane of the nose. So that sort of starts off wide and then gets more narrow towards the tip of the nose. For the mouth, it's the same technique like we did in the 10-minute pose. So the corners are the lowest, then it kind of goes up and it dips again in the middle for the top lip. And for the lower lip, just having a little bit of shadow underneath it will be enough to indicate that lower lip. And now I've got most of my stuff in, I can start figuring out stuff a little bit more precisely. So I'm going to start by putting in the pupils and the irises, just the circle. Again, like we said in the other pose as well, just making sure that it lines up with the ball of the eye and lines up the same way on both eyes. And once I'm quite happy where everything is roughly placed, I'm going to go in with my finger. You can also use a brush or a stump or a piece of tissue, and I'm just going to go over all of my shadows just to make them flat. And the reason for this is that if you look at, for instance, Rembrandt's work, there's very little detail in the shadow, and he did that on purpose because our eyes are naturally, if you test it, for instance, in real life, you can't look at both shadow and light at the same time. Our eyes adjust. So in this case, and in most cases, your eyes should be focusing on the light areas. So that means I've got to reduce the information in my dark areas to make the lights pop out more. And that's a very useful technique called focal point. Sorry, I had some camera trouble, so I've skipped a little bit of the drawing in the middle there. But basically what I started to do is now I've got my shadows in everywhere. I'm going to try and look for soft versus hard edges. So remember what I was saying about the form shadow versus the cast shadow in the 20-minute pose? Now, form shadows are usually round, so that means I've got to soften them up and make them feel like they slowly start to emerge. And with cast shadows, actually, because they start really harsh, I will put a slight line down just to indicate this is a cast shadow, not a form shadow. And like I said earlier, you want to not have too much stuff in the actual shadows. I use a little brush now just to sort of flatten them all out. It's called compressing the shadows, making sure that the shadows don't actually have that much detail in them, and then focusing all my effort of rendering and making it look good on that edge between shadow and light. Okay, so that's it for the 30-minute pose. I hope that was useful. I hope you feel like you've had a good recap or a good intro to proportions of the portrait. We're doing a figure drawing session on Wednesday, so hopefully I will see you then. And otherwise, I'll see you next week for the expressions portrait.
Thank you for taking part. Don't forget to photograph your work and post it on Instagram and hashtag it with #RawUmberLive. I'd like to thank Lizet Dingemans for drawing along with us today, and you can download the photographs you've seen in this week's session from the link I'm about to show you on the screen. You can follow us on Instagram and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and don't forget to like this video if you've enjoyed it. Thank you. Goodbye. We run free portrait drawing sessions every Sunday at 2 p.m. and figure drawing sessions every Wednesday at 8 p.m. We're now offering a Raw Umber subscription where you can watch all our figure drawing sessions, past, present and future, for under £10 a month. See our website for more details.